The Vietnam War was a brutal campaign, as Americans were rocked by social shifts at home. The Vietnam War's many faults shook their collective conscience. When the campaign's cruelties became known, many were horrified. After North Vietnam allegedly attacked American vessels in the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964, the U.S. began its full-scale involvement in the Vietnam War. However, in 1959, the CIA began recruiting South Vietnamese men for espionage and sabotage efforts. Frequently hired out of high school, the commandos were promised $2,000 annually, plus $100 monthly to their families. Every one of these commandos that entered North Vietnam were captured or killed. By 1965, the U.S. military started telling the relatives of captive commandos that their loved ones had died in the line of duty. However, hundreds had actually survived. Ex-intelligence analyst Sedgwick Tourizon explained that the military wanted to save money. By declaring the prisoners of war were deceased, it allowed the military to stop monthly payments to the grieving families. Moreover, the mission had been a humiliating failure, and officials worried the commandos were undercover communists. But the captured commandos actually withstood years, sometimes decades of torture. After the war, 281 survivors sought payment, but their service was no longer officially acknowledged. Finally, after months of media coverage, the government confirmed the cover-up in 1996. Despite pushback from the Pentagon, the commandos eventually won a court battle for back pay. Many GIs in Vietnam left behind illegitimate children, often the offspring of white or black men and Vietnamese women. These babies resembled blended enemies. Many of their mothers didn't view them as their children, but as burdens, and would often leave them in trash cans and at orphanage entrances. The Vietnamese dubbed them children of the dust, and they often became street beggars. Even those who were adopted were sometimes given away by their new parents. Peers picked on them for being poor and parentless. Many wished to walk away from Vietnam altogether and find their American fathers. However, the U.S. refused to pay attention to the children's pain. In 1970, the Defense Department defended its stance, stating that the orphans' well-being has never been and is not now considered an area of government responsibility. That tune changed in 1975. As North Vietnamese troops prepared to topple Saigon, rumors circulated that the incoming communists would slaughter anyone connected to America. President Gerald Ford greenlit Operation Baby Lift, which evacuated 2,547 orphans via airlift. The first official flight crashed, killing 138 people, 78 of whom were children. People tend to accept war over less frequent instances of torture. As Dr. Darius Rajali observed, torture gives one person absolute power over another. This distorts the torturer's morals and worsens the society that condones it. While war takes a greater material toll, torture breeds inhumanity. Perhaps that's why South Vietnam and America kept silent about placing people in tiger cages. A former prisoner compared them to coffins. Constructed by French colonialists in 1940, tiger cages were designed to hold prisoners of war, but South Vietnam used them to detain anyone deemed politically dangerous, including civilians with anti-government leanings. The New York Times described the original cages as small concrete trenches with bars on top, which tightly packed 5 to 7 people. Newer units provided by the United States contained a single inmate. North Vietnam, meanwhile, had its own incarnation of tiger cages. These were claustrophobic bamboo enclosures used to torture captive troops. Guards would starve prisoners and hit them with sticks. One prisoner remembered being force-fed soapy water and given electric shocks. A pair of sisters, arrested for attempting to aid communists, spent 7 years in tiger cages, where they were burned with quicklime. It's estimated that South Vietnam kept 20,000 to 200,000 prisoners in tiger cages, sometimes for years without trial. The practice came to light after 2 U.S. congressmen visited South Vietnam in 1970 and reported the horrors they witnessed. It's hard to quantify the harm caused by combat exposure and torture because, as the medical journal The Lancet noted, soldiers tend to be healthier than the average person. Even so, the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs found that deaths were twice as common among Vietnam veterans who experienced severe wartime stress. Some struggled with PTSD and substance abuse 40 years after coming home, not to mention increased back, joint, and neurological problems. Arizona Senator John McCain was never physically the same after surviving over 5 years as a prisoner of war. In 1967, McCain's plane was struck by a missile, forcing him to eject. In the process, he broke both arms and a leg. Then his captors wrecked his right shoulder before bayoneting him. They later performed a shoddy surgery on his leg, leaving him with a limp. To force a false confession, guards beat him every 2 or 3 hours for 4 days. McCain became incapable of lifting his arms above his shoulders.
He doesn't wave like this, he waves like this. And that's because he can't lift his arms over his shoulders.
Future Congressman Sam Johnson suffered 7 years in captivity. He spent 42 months in solitary confinement, his legs confined by stocks or shackles while he laid on a cement bed. Other prisoners of war endured having all 4 limbs bound together and then hung from meat hooks for hours or days. Reflecting on what he witnessed in Vietnam, platoon medic Larry Cottingham remarked, "There was a period when just about everyone had a necklace of ears." Cottingham served as part of the Tiger Force, a unit assembled in 1966 to out-guerrilla the Viet Cong. Initially hailed as heroes, the Tiger Force soon saw killing as, quote, "the way to live," according to one Tiger. In 1967, the Tiger Force executed an untold number of defenseless villagers. As a former member recounted, "We weren't even keeping count. I knew it was wrong, but it was an acceptable practice." Not everyone found it acceptable, though. Tiger Force member Gerald Bruner threatened to shoot his fellow soldiers if they kept killing civilians. However, a superior officer ordered Bruner to see a psychiatrist and scolded him for speaking up. A second dissenter was also silenced. Based on eyewitness accounts and government documents, the Toledo Blade, which broke the story in 2003, estimated the Tiger Force killed hundreds of helpless people. The soldiers scalped and beheaded people for their belongings and for sport. 27 members admitted that collecting ears as trophies was routine. Survivors described digging mass graves for the victims. A 4-year investigation by the military confirmed 18 culprits, none of whom faced formal consequences. Some soldiers later grappled with guilt and needed psychological counseling, but others remained remorseless.
Awful sick of her. I'll be so glad to go home. I don't know. It's the worst area we've been in since I've been in Vietnam.
In January 1968, fighting intensified with the Tet Offensive, which saw North Vietnam gaining ground against the U.S. A group of American infantrymen, known as Charlie Company, took a huge hit with 28 casualties. In March, the men moved on the village of My Lai with orders to eradicate communists. They encountered kids, mothers, and elderly men. Commanding Officer Lieutenant William Calley wanted them all dead. Private Paul Meadlow had been giving kids candy when he received the order to shoot them. He reportedly cried as he fired his weapon. Meadlow's mother would later lament, "I sent them a good boy, and they made him a murderer." Meadlow wasn't alone. Charlie Company killed 504 villagers. Some soldiers abused women and girls before gunning them down. They killed babies and burned down homes. A My Lai survivor said soldiers laughed amid the slaughter. The mayhem ended when helicopter pilot Hugh Thompson threatened to shoot Charlie Company if it didn't desist. In the aftermath, William Calley's supporters harassed Thompson for his heroism. After a year-long government cover-up, a whistleblower blew the lid off with help from journalist Seymour Hersh. 14 men stood trial, but only Calley was convicted. In 1971, he received a life sentence. In 1974, he received parole. In 1969, the same year the public learned about the My Lai massacre, more lies were told about a separate massacre. The Nixon administration started covertly carpet bombing Cambodia and kept Congress out of the loop for months. It didn't tell the public at all. Nixon dropped 540,000 tons of bombs and killed between 150,000 and 500,000 civilians. The resulting mayhem allowed a pro-American general to overthrow Cambodia's government. The country's ousted ex-leader threw his support behind the Khmer Rouge, led by Pol Pot. The Khmer Rouge were Cambodian communists who employed guerrilla tactics. They used the bombings as a political weapon, amassing enough momentum to overwhelm Cambodia's pro-US forces. The Khmer Rouge went on to implement oppressive policies and engage in atrocities that resulted in the deaths of between 1 million and 3 million people. When Pol Pot's chief torturer stood trial for his crimes, he partly blamed Nixon's carpet bombing campaign for the Khmer Rouge's reign. Nixon wanted to keep the bombing of Cambodia under wraps, even if it meant wrapping up a murder trial before it started. That year, the Green Berets conducted a top-secret operation to find out how effective the Cambodia bombings were. To the Berets' dismay, one of their operatives, Tai-Chak Chu-yen, appeared to be a communist spy. Newsweek reported that Chu-yen underwent 3 days of questioning, which failed to yield a confession. 3 Berets then shot Chu-yen in the head for supposedly stabbing them in the back. Then they dumped him in a body of water. Chu-yen's wife uncovered the killing with the help of a general who despised the Green Berets. 8 men faced criminal charges, but Nixon wanted officials to scrap the case. So a congressman friend of Nixon threatened to block defense funding if the army didn't stop the case, which it did. However, military analyst Daniel Ellsberg discovered the cover-up and leaked the Pentagon Papers, showing deception by the U.S. government during the Vietnam War. On May 12, 1975, Cambodia's communist regime, the Khmer Rouge, commandeered an American cargo ship. A Marine-led rescue effort ensued. 100 Marine reinforcements were sent to the Cambodian island of Koh Tang after the ship and its crew had already been recovered. The reinforcements were informed they would face up to 40 old men and farmers, but Koh Tang was crawling with up to 200 armed and battle-tested soldiers. Defense officials knew about the fighters, but nobody told the Marines. Suddenly, the rescuers needed rescuing. 3 Marines named Gary Hall, Joseph Hargrove, and Danny Marshall went missing. The military maintained that the men, quote, disobeyed orders by failing to reach rescue choppers on time and had likely died. But M. Song, a former Khmer Rouge commander, later stated that Hargrove had been captured, questioned, and shot. Song further alleged that his men beat Hall and Marshall to death. The U.S., however, continued counting them as, quote, unaccounted for. In 1970, the U.S. invaded Cambodia under the Nixon administration. The now disgraced president managed to keep everyone in the dark for as long as possible. He didn't even warn Cambodia's head of state, who was a U.S. ally at the time. 2 days after launching the invasion, Nixon announced it on television, leaving out the lethal aerial assaults that accompanied it. Students hammered him for perpetuating a conflict that he promised to end. At Kent State University in Ohio, students and activists protested for days and set an ROTC building ablaze. The National Guard arrived to establish order, but were unsuccessful. On May 4th, protesters hurled rocks at wary guardsmen who responded with tear gas and gunfire. 4 students died and 9 sustained injuries. The guardsmen defended the shooting as self-defense, while others saw unnecessary force amid an unnecessary war. Nixon's chief of staff said the carnage was the beginning of Nixon's downhill slide toward Watergate. Between 1961 and 1971, America showered Vietnam with 45 million liters of the herbicide Agent Orange. The rationale sounded straightforward: drown the country's jungles in plant poison to prevent Viet Cong from hiding. This meant poisoning everyone in the vicinity, but the U.S. government assured everyone that Agent Orange wouldn't hurt anyone.
How did all the children die?
Poison. Poison, you know.
The U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs lists 14 different diseases, including Parkinson's and 7 kinds of cancer, linked to Agent Orange exposure. That doesn't include the life-shortening disorders and severe disabilities suffered by the children of those exposed. In 1990, the VA revealed that the military realized Agent Orange was dangerous, but used it anyway. In fact, as The Guardian detailed, the military sprayed Agent Orange that was 25 times more potent than its own guidelines suggested.